All right, that'll work. Thank you. So at last month's council meeting, we discussed the proposed greenhouse gas rule being proposed through the Transportation Commission, and we submitted a set of comments that you all agreed to. Since that meeting, CDOT has released revisions to the rule and extended the public comment period and the rulemaking schedule for this rulemaking. So what we're going to do tonight is, we have a lot to go through, unfortunately, but is in the rule, the new rulemaking schedule, a new piece in here about and how it interacts with our planning process that we're planning to do in the next couple of years at the MPO for our transportation improvement program and our regional transportation plan. Because points that are critical and different funding sources that are impacted. And so we thought it would be worthwhile at this point to just try and lay it all out there. Next, we'll talk about what those updates are that CDOT made to the proposed rule. We proposed new comments that we could submit. Then we wanted to go through the recommendations that were last month and identify which ones had been implemented and which ones had not been implemented. And then identify the priority concerns. Since we have so many concerns that we've identified, we thought it would be useful to highlight the most important ones and put our weight behind those. Hopefully you see those changed in the rule. So for our quick one slide overview of what's in this rule, this slide I've presented before. Pretty much the same, even with the revisions that were posted from CDOT. They didn't change the fundamentals of the rule. They did make some great changes that I'll cover later, but the fundamentals are the same. So TC is revising the existing statewide transportation planning rules, adding greenhouse gas reduction levels for each MPO and for the non-MPO areas for 4 different compliance years, and those reduction levels vary by year, starting in 2020. The rule applies to the regional transportation plan and the short-term transportation improvement program for the North Front Range MPO. That's beginning October 1st of next year. 10-year priority, the 10-year plan, and the 4-year prioritized plan, and that's just for the non-MPO areas. Compliances to demand modeling and air quality modeling. And there's also an off-model analysis of projects smaller scale that still impact greenhouse gas emissions, and so those are assessed through other. If the greenhouse gas reduction levels are not met, the North Front Range would then need to use the Cmac and Stbg funds on projects that reduce greenhouse gas. Also, 10-year restricted to projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Change for this slide based on their updated proposal. In the original proposal, non-regionally significant projects, those minor projects, could go forward in the event we don't meet the greenhouse gas reduction levels for projects funded through the 10-year plan. In the revision, MPO areas no longer have that flexibility. The rural areas still do. So that's one of the differences. The rule does include a waiver process that could allow specific projects to go forward, even if we're not able to meet the reduction levels. That would have to be approved by the Transportation Commission on a project-by-project basis. So I'll quickly just cover a few things on this schedule slide. I've highlighted the changes that were made with the extension of the rulemaking process. They did extend the public comment period, which is great, something we were hoping to see. It closes now on November 18th instead of October 15th. There is one additional rulemaking hearing that's occurring next week on Wednesday. The Transportation Commission is scheduled to adopt this rule at their December meeting. Originally, that was going to be November. And so with that, I'll go on to this planning process interaction. I have 2 slides on this, and I'd like to stop at the end of the second slide you have because this is a bit complicated. So on the left, and I'll also say this was sent out in the handouts email that you all received yesterday. Can't see the slides. Hopefully you can see that information in your email. So on the left of this slide are the processes that are either in the greenhouse gas rule or in Senate Bill 260. and the timing of those. The dark gray box is a key date for us. It's the requirement from Senate Bill 260 to update our plan by October 1st of 2022. Mitigation options funds. Above that, we have this process that CDOT has said will take place through April 1st to identify how greenhouse gas mitigation measures will be selected and measured. So that will be very important to know what that process is so that we can use that information as we update our plan in compliance with the Senate Bill 260 requirement. And then the gray box at the bottom, after October 1st, any update that and any new tip needs to comply. And if not, then there are implications for the Cmac, Stbg, and 10-year plan funds. So that's the difference in the funding and the timing of these requirements. So on the right, in the blue boxes, are what we're planning to do with our current call for projects that we have open and our upcoming TIP and RTP adoptions. So at last month's council meeting, we opened the call for projects for Cmac, Stbg, and TA for funding in 2024 and 2025. We are scheduled for council to approve projects for that funding at the March council meeting in 2022. The rule does not apply yet at that time. However, the projects that are selected through that process are not shielded from future impacts from this greenhouse gas rule. And we'll get to that as we go down through this table. We will also be adopting a TIP in the spring of 2022 that brings those approved projects into our official TIP. In September, we're scheduled to update our 2045 Regional Transportation Plan in compliance with Senate Bill 260. And as I said, if those greenhouse gas reduction levels are not met, then MMOF restrictions will apply. I do note in here, our TIP is required to be consistent with the RTP. So if TIP is no longer consistent, we also have to update the TIP. So even though 260 only requires a plan update, it could have implications for our TIP as well. And that's because they're tied. These documents are tied together per federal regulations. So the last two rows on here are our plans for calendar year 2023. We're planning to adopt another TIP for 24 through 27. That's planned to occur in summer 2050 RTP in September of 2023. That's, we just updated the TIP, we just updated the plan, we're going to do it again. But we do a full. One thing I didn't mention is with this call for projects, we usually have that every 2 years, and we haven't had one in 3 years. We delayed by a year, so we are holding this one now. We wanted to make sure there's a closer time between when we award the projects and when the projects get started. So the needs are more clearly identified by the communities, but we also need enough time in between the awards and the start of the funding for the pre-project development process, IGAs and things to get going. So that's why we didn't want to delay this call for projects any further. But one other note I had on here is that North Range staff will be analyzing the greenhouse gas impacts of all of the selected projects so that we can use that information for future greenhouse gas compliance. So with that, I do want to open it up and see what questions you all have.
Well, that's the first question. How are we going to figure that out? Right? I mean, so, in a couple months, we're going to sit down and vote on projects, figure out what, the communities all got to come and apply.
It's difficult. There's so many moving pieces to this. As I said, we need the modeling guidelines. Right. We need to conduct the modeling. We're hopeful that we will meet the budgets and that there will not be implications for the projects. That's our goal. We want to get the reductions. It's only if we can't meet them, then at that point, once the rule becomes effective for Cmac Stbg and once we go and adopt our plan and TIP, then those restrictions could take effect for projects that haven't gone to add that aren't greenhouse gas reducing projects. That's when we have to take a look and see, can we get a waiver from them from the TC? Can we find a way to mitigate them and make them reducing projects? Or do we need to find other projects?
And that was going to be my other question then, I guess, is maybe this is something I brought up last month. I don't remember. That was 30 days ago and a whole election ago. But that the notion that the communities get to be at least a part of that process or see how they're being evaluated, so that the communities can either answer those questions, address the failures or concerns or whatnot, and then move forward from there. And Medora, I'm not trying to come at you with all that. It's a problem in this regulation, especially with no benchmarks or anything to measure against right now, and we're all being asked to deal with something that we don't yet know what the boundaries are on it.
I do agree. It's going to be a very intensive effort with a group effort that we're going to have to do together. Yeah.
Councillor Clark. So follow up on that. These goals or whatever you said, you're hoping that we meet the goals so we don't have to do the regulations. How practical? I mean, do we meet the goals today?
That's one of our concerns that we're going to talk about later in this presentation, that the reduction levels are pretty significant, and they were modeled based on strategies that are not within the realm of possibility based on what we see the MPO is capable of doing. So that is our concern, that we're going to kind of be forced into this non-compliant position just by the fact that the reduction levels are not feasible.
Right, and so that's exactly my point. I mean, we can hope all we want that we're going to meet these goals, but let's be realistic, we're not. And so let's say, what if we can't make the goals, and what are we going to do? And the other thing that I wanted to ask, and I think I understood from previous things, that congestion mitigation projects have now been not included as viable projects, right?
Oh, okay, let me clarify that. Yeah, I have said something similar. So what we do when we award our Cmac is we look at the formulas that are available that we've been approved through the CDOT process of how to assess impacts. And then we choose the projects that are the most effective at reducing the ozone precursors, because Cmac is designed to help us with our ozone issue. A lot of those projects are transit bus replacement or operations improvements, and currently those are not included in the list of illustrative greenhouse gas mitigation measures. So our concern is if we don't meet the reduction level, this restriction takes effect and our most effective projects can't go forward.
You just said that the transit buses wouldn't be considered a viable project?
Nor operational improvements, which is something that tortures me, to be quite honest.
That's the low-hanging fruit. They've taken it away.
Well, wait a minute. So say that again, Medora.
Okay, so in the greenhouse gas mitigation measures illustrative list of projects, they include what's the word? I don't know. Deployment of transit resources that reduce VMT. So just switching out a bus to a more efficient bus doesn't change VMT. And that's why they're saying it doesn't qualify.
VMT was never in the initial rule.
Okay.
It's only in this update.
So let me get to my next question then. On this congestion mitigation thing, which we have had discussions here over the years. For example, Highway 34, we went from 2 lanes to 3 lanes. So we've added another lane so people can go faster, not faster. They don't have to stop as much, right? That reduces, let me just talk about that, Jenny. That's not what I meant. So they reduce greenhouse gases because they're not standing there on a parking lot. But those projects now to add a lane to increase traffic flow are not going to be allowed.
Induced demand, my friend.
It's what?
Induced demand. If you build it, they will come.
Okay, yeah. So
that's their logic.
But earlier, I mean, those used to count. But didn't I hear somewhere that this new rulemaking came out and took those out now?
Yeah, there's a few different components to this. So we still have our travel demand modeling where we put in the projects and then we have that comprehensive picture of our system. We do have induced demand that's modeled in our travel model. It's part of it. There are some elements that we don't capture as well as some other types of models. So it doesn't capture maybe the full impact of some induced travel behaviors. But we have some elements in there. So when we go and model our projects and we find out what is the volume on these roads, what is the speed, that information goes into MOVES, the emissions model, And that's part of this rule as well. That's something we do already for ozone, and we're going to continue to do that for this. So in some way, we're still accounting for that full picture of the impacts. Where roadway operational improvements are being called out separately as not approved is in the greenhouse gas mitigation measures. This is the separate category that this rule is identifying as projects that get the green light in the case that you're not meeting the reduction levels. So it is calling them out as not eligible. Does that help?
I'm wondering how you're still sane after going through all of that.
Trustee Basil first, and then Mayor.
So I haven't been here nearly as long as, but have we ever met any of these targets? I mean, it seems like we always set a target and we always blow right through it. And then, so should we just start with, we're gonna miss, and then just try to focus on what that means, the impact of it. Because it seems in some sense there's this little hope that we'll somehow magically make it, and that doesn't seem possible.
Yes, so we have done budgets for our ozone conformity for quite a long time, and we've met those. This process is new. It's looking at where we're expected to be and then taking a 6 to 8% cut off of that and asking us to make that reduction. And that's not the type of approach we've used to set budgets for ozone. So this is really a new approach. Some other states have done some similar types of requirements on MPOs related to greenhouse gas, but it's very few. California, I'm forgetting the other states. Really, this is a pretty new approach for Colorado to be doing. And asking us to go below what we're already projecting is a tall order.
Maren, please.
Oh, thank you. I have two questions. One, as you know, I don't know how many MPOs there are in Colorado.
5.
Okay, and how many of them will also are in danger of missing?
5.
Okay, so that's good. I mean, that's that's something that's because we want to take these data back to CDOT, right, and the legislature, and then the VMT. Reduction seems like a crazy criteria because it's out of our control, 1. And 2, with growth, we're going to have more VMT. And 3, if we're transitioning to electric vehicles, that should actually be in our favor, not the metric of VMT. Seems hopelessly outdated. Who we talk to?
Welcome to the conversation.
That's what you talk about.
Oh, excellent. Kathleen.
Conversation at the Transportation Commission.
Okay.
I'm curious what the other, I'm here to listen what the questions and concerns are. I
Good.
met with
Right.
Suzette and Medora several times, and this is what I'm a conduit for what you're expressing tonight back to the commission. We're hearing things from across the state. Sorry. I'm afraid to move this if it's going to work or not work. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's why I'm here, is to hear this information. It's not perfect. Whatever comes from this, my own opinion is it won't be perfect, but we have to get started. And because this is new, there aren't a lot of examples, but there are some. And there are things we have to do, and we have to get started, and we have to start climbing our way out of the hole we're in. We are in a hole in terms of our environmental impact for transportation. That affects our economy, it affects our communities, it affects our public health. So we have to figure out what to do. And just like many years ago when all of the air quality standards were new, people's hair was on fire that we were never going to be able to handle the air quality regulations. I mean, I've been in transportation 30 years. I remember when it was like, how are we going to do this? And why do we have to do multimodal projects? This is that type of era, right? We're transforming how we're thinking about transportation and the holistic set of impacts, both pro and con. It's very obviously vital for our economy, for our communities, for connecting people's to jobs and opportunities, but how can we do this going forward in a more sustainable way? And this is one piece. There's a whole other piece around electrification of vehicles. So that's a very real piece. And this is why I think all through this process, the North Front Range, and in particular, Medora and Suzette have done a really fantastic job of saying, it will probably get there, but like this schedule is really helpful for me because I've been asking for this for a long time because I want to see the 2 MPOs, to your question, that come out of the gate with this are the North Front Range and Dr. Cog. Those are the 2 first ones. So I've been asking, how does the CDOT GHG rulemaking timeline between now and into 2022 and beyond, how does that overlay with the MPO timelines for North Front Range and for Dr. Cog? Because they all have to fit together and we need to figure. So this is the first time, again, that I've seen this in a way that makes sense to me, like, okay, this is what's going to happen when. And so I hope we can see that more often. I'm curious how, and I can ask Dr. Cog, but is your timeline the same as theirs? Or this is your timeline? So there'll be a North Front Range timeline, a CDOT timeline, and a Dr. Cog timeline. So we've got to figure out how they align or don't. That's one of the things I guess I'm taking back from this information. So, and then on the conversation on operational examples, my understanding from reading the revised rule, they provided some illustrative examples of what either is or isn't eligible. If there are specific things that you think should be eligible, like we talked the other day, like transit queue jump lanes or whatever specific operational things would make sense, let's add that. Make that specific recommendation, because right now it's just a blanket statement, either operational improvements count or they don't count. It's like 2 extremes. Well, there's got to be a part in the middle that says these types of operational improvements improve flow of transportation and they reduce greenhouse gas. So let's figure out what that subset is. So the theme of this is the more specific examples you all can provide, the more likelihood of it getting incorporated into the next iteration of the rule. So I hope that helps, but that's why I'm here. And so
great.
Keep the comments coming. That's my job. And I can't promise, and I never promise I could take 100% of all the things. You guys have great suggestions and make them stick in the rule, but I think the way you're bringing these forward is really helpful.
So much
There's-
about
there's 1,200 pages of comments online. Yeah,
Go for
so there's a
15.
lot.
So much about the operational part of things. I think, technology is our hope to improve this. A simple, synchronized traffic lights will prevent people from sitting at lights. And when they throw that out, I'm befuddled at best, and I think it's disingenuous at worst. And so that would be my comment. Why can't we have technological adaptations like signal timing? Medora, I guess my question is, and you and I have been on more Zoom calls, that when are we just going to have it implanted in our brain, mark of the beast, and then put in front of our eyes and that kind of thing. But as you and I have sat on these, I still want to know if, as they've ran the models that have given the North Front Range their goal, are we fully understanding of the inputs in their model?
We've gotten a lot of information on the inputs, but we still have some questions. And I will get to that in a later slide.
Okay.
But yes, that's a good question. And I'm really appreciating this discussion, but I'm wondering if we might want to keep going because I do have a lot of other slides.
Because we have lives and families.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Chair, just one more.
Yeah.
Kathleen, what seems difficult there is from the standpoint of there's a group that's sitting down to write the regulation and then coming to us and saying, well, what else do you want in order to measure traffic improvements when your baseline measurement is VMT, right? Additional lanes, better signals, better interchanges doesn't change VMT. And so, from the standpoint of somebody writing a law, if there's something that you want, right, that you want to achieve, you got to spell it out. And you have to make room. You can make room by simply saying any project that reduces greenhouse gas by, reducing vehicle RPM, not just VMT, but the speed at which the engine's running, because that's generating pollution. I mean, to some degree, this is on you guys, frankly. shouldn't have to be on us. We just heard from Mike that we're breathing Dr. Cog's ozone. So how's that playing into our compliance as well? So you know, I'm frustrated over this. So those things, that's what's really frustrating here. How do we meet these measurements? I think that's what the commission needs to hear, right? Is that you need to lay it out so that we can meet these things. Is there? I guess we've had the answer. No MPO has said we can meet this. Is that why Dr. Cog has a different deadline? Because
we have their process.
It's their process.
Yeah.
What I heard you say is their time frame where they're doing their RTP and TIP is different. But their target is, the target is the same for everyone.
Okay.
Well, I will, just to clarify, that the numeric targets vary, but as a percentage of what we're projected to emit, they're mostly equivalent. Yes, we're all expected to cut our emissions
by a given
similar amount,
similar
proportionally.
amount.
Yeah.
Okay.
Please continue, whatever. Let's
Okay.
get moving.
Okay, so next I wanted to cover the major updates in the revision that was released in mid-October from CDOT. I've organized them. This first slide are the changes that either align with the recommendations this council approved or are changes that I think you guys will all approve. So these are the positive ones. They removed the greenhouse gas baselines from the rule. This is something we advocated for because when you go to demonstrate your compliance, then you can use the same modeling platform and the same assumptions that are still valid for both the baseline and the action scenario, so you have a fair comparison. So that was a great change they made. They removed the pocket veto. So now TC does have to vote to deny a waiver or reconsideration request. They specified a turnaround time for the TC decision on the greenhouse gas transportation report. It's a pretty quick turnaround, 30 days or the next meeting, whichever is later. So that provides some helpful clarity to the MPOs and CDOT about when to expect a response on if that report is acceptable. There were a few examples of mitigation measures for rural areas that were added to the rule. And finally, they added some detail on involving disproportionately impacted communities during the statewide planning process and how to consider impacts to those communities. So the next two slides are some changes in the revised rule that staff have identified some concerns with. So one of them we mentioned earlier, there's this new requirement for CDOT to measure vehicle miles traveled per capita. And then that report will happen every year. It'll be for each of the regional areas. CDOT will put together this VMT per capita. After 3 years, if that statistic is not going down for any of the regional areas, then the TC has to consider if there should be revisions to this rule. And we have some comments on that in a future slide, so I'll just keep going on with these changes. So another change is that, I mentioned this earlier, for the NPO areas, the non-regionally significant projects funded by the 10-year plan funds can no longer go forward in the event we don't meet the reduction levels, whereas rural areas still have that flexibility. Okay, the last change to discuss is CDOT heard, which was a legitimate concern, that the mitigation measures weren't clearly defined. They had those illustrative examples, but how that process would work was unknown, which made it hard to know, how is this rule going to work? What comments do we need to make? So they did identify some principles that they would use as that process unfolds. There are 5 principles. They put them in the preamble to the rule, which is not legally binding, and also in a draft policy memo that they released the same day as the updated rule. The 5 principles are listed on the slide. I don't think we'll go through them to save time, but I do have some notes on them in a future slide. So based on those revisions, staff have identified 3 possible additional comments that we could make prior to the close of the public comment period. And these comments include removing the requirement for TC to consider revising the rule based on the VMT per capita changes. The rule is designed to get greenhouse gas emission reductions.
If I had a bill, I'd be ready.
The rule should remain focused on that and look at the greenhouse gas emissions to determine if there should be revisions to the rule. VMT is one of many factors that influence the amount of emissions coming out of our transportation system.
But if they obtain their goal of electrification, then VMT could say remain constant or even increase.
Yes,
So
and
VMT is an inaccurate measure of greenhouse gas.
And in fact, the more we electrify our fleet, the harder it becomes to achieve these targets in the rule, because they've specifically pulled those out. Those aren't part of our ability to reduce. And there's no mechanism in the rule to account for, are we reducing our emissions further than what we expected? Are we doing better overall? They're only looking at the planning related reduction. So it's not fully matching to the reality of the emissions from our transportation system.
GHG is traffic engineering, VMT is social engineering. Let's remain traffic engineers.
So another proposed additional comment is to remove the greenhouse gas mitigation principles from the preamble. Now, I did say it was helpful that they gave some more insight into what they were thinking. However, I do think these are a bit premature, that they are restricting some of the mitigation measures that we could use. They are creating some more burdensome processes. One of those is a potential requirement for project level modeling during the long range planning process. That's a lot of modeling to assess at that time. It's very burdensome. And there are also a few differences in how they wrote the principles between the preamble and between the mitigation policy memo, so it's not clear which version they intended to carry forward. For example, under disproportionately impacted communities, the memo said that, well, I'm forgetting which one said which. One of them said credit would be applied for mitigations in disproportionately impacted areas, boosting the points or the value of those. And the other one just said that it would be considered and didn't really explain if there would be more points. So what we wrote in this draft letter, which you all received along with these slides yesterday, is that these principles need to go through more of a public process than we have time to do right now. They should be informed by that process and go through a policy directive, and that can inform how the mitigation measure process works. We had a third proposed new comment. This one isn't actually based on the revisions that were released by CDOT, but it's an issue that we became aware of recently, which is that the rule requires compliance with 4 future compliance years out to 2050. For the North Front Range NPO, when we are going to demonstrate compliance next year with our 2045 plan, our plan doesn't go out to 2050. We don't have funds or projects identified in those last 5 years. So it could be a real challenge to say by 2050, we're expecting this difference when we don't have the last 5 years of projects or funds to change. Even more concerning is for CDOT. They have written this rule so that it applies to the 10-year plan. And yet they also have budgets beyond that in 2040 and 2050. So we wanted to raise some concerns about how plans that don't go out as far as these budgets could demonstrate a difference when there's no planning happening in those timeframes. So the next phase of this is to go over the 13 comments that we made in October and whether or not they were addressed in the updated rule. And I also wanted to note that as we move past that and start talking about them in a little bit more detail, we thought, since many of them weren't addressed, that we should make some additional clarifying points in our letter to help move them forward. And so on the slides, when there is an additional comment that is in the letter that you received yesterday, the draft letter, there is this purple circle marking that on the slide to denote that it's an additional comment that we added. So of those 13 recommendations, 2 of them were implemented. We've covered those already, removing the baselines and requiring a vote of the TC to deny waivers. So those both made it in. There were another 2 recommendations that we've been told by CDOT are in progress. They weren't released with the revised rule. And the other ones, well, actually, number 12 is a mix. That one included a lot of minor process clarifications, and some of those were implemented and some weren't. So the rest were not implemented. And that's what we want to focus on for the next part of this presentation, is those recommendations that weren't implemented, and trying to see which of those we might find to be our priorities that we want to put the most weight behind in our letter and also in our testimony at the rulemaking hearing next week, Wednesday. So staff have gone ahead and chosen the 3 that we think are priorities. So I'll present those to you in a little bit more detail. And then the other ones that were not implemented, I'm going to go through quickly due to time, but feel free to pause and ask questions, especially if you think it might be a priority. That would be very appropriate. So the first priority we have identified is developing practicable greenhouse gas reduction levels using strategies within our control that are not expected to occur through market forces. So things like removing the tripling telework assumption, of removing land use changes, having more reasonable assumptions about transit expansion. So we have 2 additional comments we added to the letter. One of them is that additional information we received from CDOT showed that the increase in transit, which they had described as a 151% increase in transit service, actually looks like a 276% increase in transit service, because the model platform that they used was looking at transit expansion in a per capita term. And they still had that 151 number in the file, but it was per capita. And so when you layer that on top of the population growth, it's actually a 276%, or, it's a lot larger. And the cost benefit analysis was assessing the cost of just a 151% increase in transit. In addition, the transit expansion strategy doesn't account for the changes that we've all experienced with COVID, reduced transit service, reduced ridership, and these aren't expected to go away anytime soon. What this strategy is saying is that by 2022, we're going to start increasing our service 6% year over year compared to 2019 levels, not recognizing that we're already behind the gate on that.
Well, we just got our service.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The driver shortage. Mm-hmm.
And that 276% increase, that applies to Johnstown, Milliken, and Frederick, and Firestone, and Meade, Dakota, and
So another proposed priority is to expand implementers of greenhouse gas mitigation measures. On this recommendation, we're noting that the efforts of our member governments are really important. Even if they don't get influenced by policies of the MPO, they're still making a difference on the greenhouse gas mitigation or greenhouse gas emissions in our region. There isn't a restriction on who implements regionally significant projects. If a local community funds a roadway capacity project with local funds, it still gets brought in and analyzed. It's a project that impacts our system. And so we think the same logic should apply to the mitigation measures and have the efforts of our local member governments count toward this mitigation measure process. It would also incentivize them for more action. The third proposed priority is to include operation strategies in the greenhouse gas mitigation measures. I'm guessing you guys will all agree with this one. Mm-hmm. We did add additional clarification on here that because the proposed rule added this restriction in the preamble, we just wanted to put more weight behind this, that we need to use all the tools in the toolbox to address our greenhouse gas emissions. And just like the Clean Air Act has the transportation control measures approach, where there are VMT reducing strategies, there are operations improvement strategies, and there are vehicle scrappage replacement strategies. So using all those together, we're more likely to achieve our goal of emission reductions. Okay, so now is my attempt to be more quick about these other recommended improvements that were not implemented. We had a recommendation to set per capita greenhouse gas reduction levels. This would help the rule be flexible and reflect updated population growth and forecasts and potential changes to boundaries. We did add a note that this recommendation remains relevant even though they've removed the greenhouse gas baselines from the rule, because the reduction level is still static. It will still be easier or harder to meet based on these changing growth forecasts. Recommendation 4 is to correct errors in the greenhouse gas reduction levels caused by inadvertently when the data was switched between two different modeling platforms. Recommendation 5 is to require reassessment of the greenhouse gas reduction levels. We laid out a process that they could use to regularly reassess If these reduction levels are feasible through the state interagency consultation team, then bring that information to the TC for them to decide if the rule should be revised. Recommendation 9, to remove or modify the requirement for tips. I mentioned this earlier, that tips have to be consistent with the RTP. So this recommendation is really just to simplify the administrative process for this rule. Recommendation 10 is to remove restrictions on Cmac funded projects. We've also talked about this, how we award our Cmac funding to the projects that are most effective at reducing ozone precursors. And based on the illustrative examples in the rule, it seems that we might not be able to award those funds to the projects with the most benefit in the event that we don't meet the greenhouse gas reduction levels. Recommendation 11, allowing the non-regionally significant projects funded with Stbg to go forward. We did add an additional note here because of that revision in the rule that treats the MPO areas and the rural areas differently, that this really is an equity issue, that these non-regionally significant projects aren't increasing capacity. They're often addressing these critical safety and maintenance issues that occur in rural areas and non-rural areas. Recommendation 12 is our list of additional clarifications. A lot of these were implemented in the revised rule, which was great. So in the comment letter that we sent to you yesterday, we just noted the few that weren't. And also on those first two bullets, it looked like there was an attempt to implement them, but then there was something that wasn't, and so it ends up conflicting with itself in the revised rule. There's a statement about unlimited time for one and 30 days in another section, and then 60 days and 30 days. So the timing requirements aren't lining up in the revised rule. Our recommendation 13 is to clarify and update assumptions in the CBA. I'm not going to go through what was in there before, but I do want to note the new recommendation in there about the overall cost. So what North Front Range staff did is looked at the methodology reported in the CBA and recalculated the values that were reported based on the CBA methodology, with a few adjustments based on planning best practices. So for example, transit buses, have an expected life span of 12 years or so. So after that time, you'd need to buy a new bus. So we did incorporate that. And we ended up estimating a cost of $18.8 billion to implement the strategy CDOT modeled, whereas the CBA estimates a cost of $4.5 billion. So that's a concern.
And that was with a B.
That was the most awesome understatement I've ever heard.
That's a concern.
So
I want to take a look at that one.
what we want to do now, this is the list of recommendations that weren't implemented plus the 3 new ones. And I've labeled on there the 3 that staff have identified as priorities. And so I wanted to open it back up again and see, do you think these are the right priorities? Are these the right set of recommendations to be carrying forward again in our final comment letter? We want to emphasize the priorities in the letter, and also, as I said, the rulemaking hearing is occurring next week, Wednesday. It's the final rulemaking hearing. We will be presenting oral testimony. North Front Range staff will be presenting. And so the priorities that you identified tonight are the ones that we'll underscore at that rulemaking hearing.
Do we still only have like 3 minutes to talk, or because
3 minutes?
And I heard you're a fast talker, so I mean that's probably the reason for identifying priorities in this group, right? Is that we probably can't get through in oral testimony all the things that we'd like to see. So we really need to concentrate on the things that have the most.
Well, if I may,
Sure.
I think there's two things that we've done is that we've combined our time. We've had myself, the chair, and Becky Carrasco also. We've all signed up together. We said we will let everybody that wants 3 minutes go ahead of us. And then if we can get the 12 minutes combined, that we would do that somewhat like we did last time. And so CDOT staff seems open to that.
Oh, that's good.
But I think the reason for the priority, quite frankly, is there is a lot in here. And there's a lot of comments in here. And I think if we say we want you to address all of these in a lot of detail, it's just going to be, they have a month or less than a month, CDOT staff, to look at all of these. So that's why we thought a priority would be important so that we would really hit on the ones that we thought were really important.
So is there another way to tackle that though, by sending the MPO and saying we're bringing 3 people, but then Larimer County, Kristen, you bring 2 or 3 people, and sit on the other side of the room, right? I mean, because they can't, from a public testimony perspective, they can't say we're only going to hear 5 people.
I think you have to sign up, right?
Yeah, agreed.
It'll be signed up
Absolutely.
by the 9th at 11
Right.
a.m., the day before
Or you can
11
still
a.m.
sign up?
Yeah.
Right. Now, of course, having said all this, I'm in trial prep and doing mediation next week. I'd rather not go to trial, but I think that's another way to skin the cat there, is to get the members, the members of the MPO signing up separately, so that way,
Are you saying to add to the amount of time that Medora has to speak, or that we should speak separately and
Separately.
each address different?
right.
Or, I mean, we could each speak separately and all
Catherine,
address
put
the
your fingers in
same,
your ears. Just kidding.
same thing. I mean, I think it could dilute the message a little bit if we have too many priorities.
Yeah, and keep in mind, we can submit written comments as well. And,
Right.
and those
Right.
written comments carry a lot of gravitas because they study those as well. And so, the 3 minutes is kind of just the show.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Right.
And if we could make our comments point to the written comments, which I know they will. Medora, as far as your priorities, I would like to see your new number 14 added as a priority. VMTs just popped up in the second incarnation of this rule. They completely changed the face of the rule, in my humble opinion. And we need to keep this focused on greenhouse gas. If it's a greenhouse gas rule, it needs to stay focused on greenhouse gas.
So would you add that as a new one at 4 or just?
Well, if you're running, I see that more important than 6.
Okay.
But if you got time for 4, you got time for 4. Lady, I'm sorry.
I thank you, Medora, for all your
Yes.
work on this and for laying it out in a very clear manner. Sometimes I get very confused, and this was very easy to follow. So thank you for that. I do agree that the VMT, since they did add that new, it should be either, I don't know which one it should replace if we need to replace one, but it should be one that we also focus on. And then I did have a question. So are we still writing a letter addressing all of this? And so we're just discussing which ones should be at the hearing.
Yes, so there is a letter that we drafted, and it got sent out yesterday with the slides. So
I didn't see that. I was just curious, making sure that.
yeah, we will be submitting that letter, and in a few slides we'll talk about exactly how we want to do that, because there is a few data items that I've requested from CDOT that I haven't received. And so there's this time we have in between our current council meeting tonight and the close of the public comment period. So we'll get there, though, of how we want to address that. But yes, we will be submitting a letter. We wanted to also identify in the letter the priorities, because again, we've raised so many issues that we think at least focusing the attention on the ones we think are most critical, maybe at least we can get those changed.
Medora, what remains unreceived?
The changes to the data inputs on the CBA are questions I've requested. It wasn't submitted through that formal letter that the North Front Range submitted, but on my own, and CDOT's acknowledged that.
The direction you need from us is the priorities.
Yeah, so are there any other comments on the priorities?
Please.
I think the 3 priorities are great, and the VMT as a 4th priority. And the oral comment, I think, is fine if the 3 of you go. As a receiver of a lot of oral comments, you listen, but more people making the same point, it can annoy you. But 3 very concise presentation, and the oral followed up with detailed written comment is very powerful and effective, in my view.
Who is, Suzette, you are, Medora, you are,
Chair
and Will is, okay.
Great.
I am commenting on behalf of Will, but.
And Becky, you said as well.
Yeah, we added, because Medora had to talk so fast last time. We added an extra player.
And
I mean, I
Mayor,
said
Mayor,
this-
my point was not to go repeat, but
Oh, yeah.
if you know, I think if there's a community that says, well, you know, like Commissioner James, if you're saying, hey, we got to hit 14 and there's not an opportunity, then, you know, Weld County ought to sign up and you know.
That will be in Weld County's testimony. I can almost assure you, sir.
And, I mean, no doubt you already did. And that was
fine.
my only
Yep.
point there.
Yep.
But I do agree. I see. To me, what I think is funny is that the inclusion of VNT in this go around is just an admission of what they wouldn't say the first time. It was clear that VNT was the base. You know, that's what they were attacking. But I do think since that admission now is open and public, you know, I'd move that up up the list as well.
So is everybody good with the 3 becoming 4 priorities? Other input you need from us?
I do have a few more slides. Almost done though.
How can you not love her? I mean, she's so good at what she does. And she's so unassuming. It's only $5.4 billion. You know?
Honestly, if
She's gonna
they,
practice this weekend. For 12 minutes.
For 8 weeks.
She's so good at talking back at you. That's great.
honestly, if we had number 3, we wouldn't probably need the rest. Can you go back?
On priorities.
I mean,
Yeah, I know. It's true.
Right? I mean, that's the number 1 priority is something that feels achievable to us, right? I mean, the rest is kind of gravy, but,
Well, and to some degree too, Commissioner, like some might address others, right? Like if you fix number 3, I don't know, I don't know, drill down. If you fix number 3, maybe that fixes half of, you know, number 14, but.
Well, let's go to slide 24. We had that request for additional data. We have received a lot of that data, and that's helped us improve some of our comments, but we are waiting for some additional data on the greenhouse gas reduction level corrections. So we've identified our priority comments. As I said, we have those outstanding data requests, and so this is a question we have for you on how we should proceed. With the letter that we've drafted, one option is to go ahead and submit it now to CDOT, and then if we get additional data, submit additional comments, addenda that could be approved by the executive committee, because we're not going to have a council meeting before the close of the public comment period. Another option is to not submit the letter, hold off, and if we do get additional data, make those data adjustments in the letter and submit that closer to the end of the public comment period. Is there a preference from council on which approach we take?
do we think we're going to get it?
Yeah, and you want to know when?
Honestly, I think if we send it now and then they provide the data later on, that's just them fulfilling a request from earlier, and it doesn't really change anything that we put in. So I say just send it now.
Probably send it now. I mean, how late can you get the data and still make, realistically, and make the changes that you need to, and analyze it and make the changes in that letter? I mean, that we're at the 4th. Is today the 4th?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, and it's the 10th is
The 18th.
oh
18's
18.
when the written comments are due. Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's a little bit more time than I was thinking. I was thinking the 10th. Is there something happening?
The 10th is the rulemaking hearing.
Okay,
Mhm.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, I mean, I'd probably send the letter and then an addenda if we have time.
Okay.
Other comments?
Do we need to send an additional letter to request the data again? I mean, how would we get that? How would we make that happen?
That's a legitimate
Maybe it is,
point.
but please send us back the
That's something I could incorporate into this letter. I've been emailing with CDOT staff and they've been responsive, but I think we could include it in the letter. It's a good idea.
And if you can let me know what remaining data is missing, I can help ask for that as well. She can send emails, but that would be helpful.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you, Kathleen.
So the last thing is if you approve these comments, the new comments and carrying forward those recommendations that were implemented, it's in that draft letter that was sent to you yesterday that we covered in this presentation. And so this is an action item. We're looking for your approval of those comments or any adjustments for that letter.
Medora, one area of concern, and it has nothing to do with your comments or what you presented this evening, but my area of concern lies with when we get into the actual mitigation projects and the mitigation measures, and what that comes in April, and we'll get to see what we can use, what on-the-shelf projects we have, what kind of credit will be, I'm assuming what kind of credit we'll get as far as GHG reduction. Hopefully we'll see a cost, because I think the taxpayer needs to see an ROI, quite frankly. And so will there be another public process at that time? Will we get to have input? Will we get to go back saying, this has been such a fun exercise?
Oh, I know. It gets to keep going. Yes, CDOT has said that this greenhouse gas mitigation measure process, which will conclude by April, will be an open public process with involvement from MPOs. So you may hear more from me.
Okay. So do we need is this a formal action? Do you need is there a resolution attached?
It's not a resolution,
No?
but you do need to take action on it.
I just want to make sure that it's clear, I'm going to recuse myself from the vote on this. So please provide the comments. Again, huge thanks to all of you, all of the staff for all of the work and all of the specificity that you provided. And if there's things I could do to follow up, let me know, and continue to participate in the process for this and then going forward.
I know Chair Karspect would make this comment, and I'll make it for sure. Medora, thank you for your work, because I know this has been a tireless effort for you, and you have done it so well. And we appreciate it very much. What would a proper motion be?
So you have the draft letter in front of you. So I would say if you
Move to approve the day. Okay.
move to approve the letter with the addition of the fourth priority being modified in the letter.
So moved.
Second.
A motion and second to approve the draft letter with the addendum made this evening. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries.
Hold on,
Thank
let
you.
me check it out.
On the chat.